Okay, so I'm going to start again. On last Shabbat, we read Parashat Lech Lecha, where we meet Abraham for the first time. And unlike Noach, where the Torah tells us from the very beginning, Ish tzaddik tamim haya bedorotav, right? Gives us some sort of a description or an explanation why God chose Noah, because he was a tzaddik. About Avram, when it comes to Abraham, the Torah doesn't tell us anything. And therefore, a tremendous amount of midrashim came later on trying to explain what was it about Abraham already from the very beginning that caused God to start talking to him and choose him. So, for example, one famous midrash talks about tells us that Abraham already as a kid realized that there's a greater power, greater than the sun and the moon, and that's the one that rules all over the world. And therefore he recognized God on his own, right? Remember that. And there's another midrash, for example, that tells us about Abraham smashing all the idols that were built by his father. And then what he does, he takes the axe and he put it in the hands of the big idols. And when his father says, what have you done? So he said, what do you want from me? I didn't do it. It's like this guy did it. As his father says to him, are you kidding me? This is an idol. He's made out of wood. He's made out of stone. He can't do anything. And he tells him, that let your ears hear what your mouth, what the words, what you're saying is ridiculous. This is an idol. You just made it out of stone and wood. So how can this be a God, right? Fine. We have to remember that all those wonderful stories, all those wonderful midrashim are not part of the Chumash, are not part of the Torah, right? The Torah does not tell us the story about Abraham smashing the idols that his father dropped. The Torah doesn't tell us about Abraham recognizing God and all that kind of stuff. These are midrashim that were written much later, after the canonization and the completion of the Tanakh. By the way, just as a side note, I always like this midrash that, kind of put Abraham in front of his father, Terach, and, this argument that they had, what have you done with the idol and everything, all that kind of stuff. And I would like to suggest that perhaps Abraham was able to convince Terach, his father at that point, to recognize God, and that explained to us why Terach is the one that starts the journey from Ur Kasdim to Eretz Israel. So I'm just going to share my screen for a second, which I apologize, is going to take me a second. That's gonna be a problem. Hold on. Okay. Let me.
What is the problem?
Here we go. So this is our topic. The Queen Mother, as she appears in the book of Daniel. If you remember, if you can recognize this picture, of course, this is Daniel from the Sistine Chapel that was made by Michelangelo, of course. But back to our story with Abraham. What happens? Look at the text. We always think about this idea that God spoke to Abraham and God told Abraham, Lech lecha, go, etc. Right? Mm-hmm. But if you look at the text very carefully, you'll discover something slightly different. Vayikach Terach et Avraham bno. Terach takes Abraham, his son, and Lot ben Haran ben Beno, and also his grandson, Lot, who was the son of Haran. Haran already died at an earlier age. Ve'et Sarai kalato, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, wife of Abraham. Vayitzu itam Ur Kasdim lalechet aretz Canaan. And they leave from Ur Kasdim to go to Canaan. ויבואו עד חרן וישבו שם. However, on the way, they got stuck in Haran. והיו ימי תרח 5 שנים ו200 שנה, וימות תרח בחרן, and Terach dies in Haran on the way to Eretz Israel. So who's the one that starts the journey to Eretz Israel? It's not Abraham, but rather it's Terach, his father. So what I would like to suggest here, that perhaps if we take into account this midrash, that yes, we believe that Abraham is the one that recognized God in one way or the other. However, he was somehow able to convince his father, and Terach was to somewhat a believer, and they start as a family the journey. Otherwise, Terach would not have started the journey towards Canaan. Another proof that this was going on, that Terach was also, recognized monotheism in some way, is taking place about 200 years later. 200 years later, if you remember the story that Yaakov, that's already Abraham's grandson, he is running away from his father-in-law, Lavan. And Lavan chase him and he find him. And he says to him, and they make an agreement, Elohei Avraham ve'Elohei Nachor yishpetu v'neinu. The God of Abraham and the God of Nachor, which is the same God, what he's saying, will be kind of the witness between us. What does it mean? Who is Nachor? Nachor is the father of Lavan, right? Nachor is Abraham's brother. Sorry, Nachor is the grandfather of Lavan. I'm sorry, right? Nachor had a son named Betuel. Betuel was the father of Lavan and Rivka. So the fact is that they're talking about the same God for Abraham and Nachor. It means that what? That there was some sort of a recognizing. There was some sort of a recognition.
You took all of
Okay,
it.
I'll have to
You said
do that.
The Swiss cheese.
I'll have to do it manually and mute everybody.
Wait, don't talk. Just give it to me. Don't call anymore because when you call me, it ruins the class.
Okay, I'm sorry, guys, that we have to do that. I'm just gonna try to manually mute everybody.
Good.
I'm going to try to do that. It'll take me a second. Okay. So, indeed, it seems that already the God of Nachor is the God of Abraham. How come Nachor has the same God of Abraham if it's not was accepted already by their father, Terach? Okay, in any event, the point is that we understand that those midrashim came to kind of fill in the blanks about the childhood of Abraham or the events that brought to this revelation or whatever, or this understanding about God. Which brings us to this picture, which is another midrash about Abraham. Okay, there's a midrash, a famous midrash. If you look here, Bereshit Rabbah, it's here in Aramaic. Nasbo Mesarel Nimrod. Terach gives Abraham, for whatever reason, doesn't matter. It's like we're in the middle of a very long midrash, to Nimrod, who was the king at the time. And Abraham and Nimrod start a whole theological discussion. Nimrod was he believed in the God of fire. And he said, like, you got a fire, and Abraham says, you know what? No, the God of water is superior because water can extinguish the fire, etc., etc., and goes for a couple of pages, and they have a lot of longer discussion over there. And finally, Nimrod says, "Ani eini mishtachave ela le'ur." Okay, I bow down only to the fire. Harei ani mishlachecha betocho. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to throw you into the fire, into the furnace. And I want to see if your God is going to come and save you. And of course, indeed, what happened, there was an angel or Kadosh Baruch Hu, whatever. Abraham was saved from the fire. And okay, that's a very famous midrash. By the way, this midrash also tried to explain another problem in the text. We said that Haran, Abraham's brother, died in early age, and they're trying to explain what was, how did he die? Why did he die? And according to this midrash, what happened was that Haran was kind of the fence, and he was watching this debate between Nimrod and Abraham, his brother, and he said, like, if Abraham is going to win, I'm with him. That means his God is the God, and I'm going to be a believer in his God. But if Nimrod is going to win, then he's got the right answers. I'm going to be a chassid of his God. And what happens? And of course, since he was not a true believer, he was thrown into the fire because he thought he's going to be saved just like Abraham. And of course, he was not saved. And this is how the Midrash tried to explain how come Haran died at early age. Okay, that's a kind of a side note. Now, Rabbi Top had an interesting question on Shabbat. He asked how that's possible that such an important event like throwing Abraham into the furnace, into the fire, this is not in the Torah. If this is such an important story, how come it's not in the Torah? And a couple of explanations I'm going to share with you very quickly. My personal explanation, I think that the Torah is not interested in telling us that for a specific reason, because it really doesn't, it's not important where you're coming from. The background, your background, completely irrelevant. You can come from the family of idols manufacturing. What's important is only what you do. And therefore, Abraham's recognition in God is the most important thing. Okay? That's my explanation. In any event, back to our story. What is important to realize that these are midrashim. This is a midrash that the rabbis created later on. I don't know if it's true or not, doesn't matter. The point is why the rabbi did that. What are they trying to teach us by putting it there? And what's really important is that this story of Abraham being thrown into the fire is similar, and it's actually a duplication of another story that is recorded in the Bible. What is the story that is recorded in the Bible? Which brings us to today's topic, is the story that is in the book of Daniel, where Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are thrown into the fire and were saved by the angel. Okay, we're going to talk about it in a second. So now we're talking about, you already know that the lady that we're going to uncover today is mentioned in the book of Daniel. According to my understanding, why this Midrash of Abraham was created, was created in order to have this connection to the story that is brought in the book of Daniel, i.e., when Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are thrown into the fire and were saved. The idea is to show that just like Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah throw into the fire and saved because of their belief in God, so was Abraham. He was standing strong against everybody else in his belief, just like Michael just like Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah. And both stories talk about individuals against society, about children. Both Abraham and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are children at that time, or young adults, versus powerful leaders. It's the king of Bavel, or in the story of Abraham, it is Nimrod. It's the kids that got it right and the adults get it wrong. Okay, and many, many, many other points that are similar between the two stories. Okay, so I'm gonna stop the sharing for a sec. And since we never discussed the book of Daniel, let's jump into that for a minute. So the book of Daniel is one of the most enigmatic books in the Bible. Parts of the book of Daniel are written in Aramaic, and parts of the book are talking about the prophecies of the end of the days. Very difficult material to understand. I can say that I understand it myself. The book of Daniel deals in the period between the exile of Jehoiachin, the king of Yehuda, by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Bavel, 18 years from the time that Jehoiakim, actually it's 18 years before the destruction of the first temple. So this is roughly where this book starts until the beginning of the second temple. So it includes all the years in the exile, all the 70 years. And of course, as we know, Bavel was not the empire at that time, but rather it was Darius the second. It's Madayu Paras. That's the Persians were the empire by then. That's the beginning of the second temple. So roughly we're talking about a period of about 100 years. Now, the Talmud attributes this book to the writing of this book to the people, the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, members of the Great Assembly, i.e., the beginning of the second temple. And the book deals with certain historic events, and both from the time of Daniel himself, specifically his prophecies about Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Bavel at the time, and later on also visions that he has dealing with the end of the first Babylonian empire and the rise of the Persian empire, etc. And the book is actually divided to two sections. The first section talks about the life of Daniel and his friends, who were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in the kingdom of Bavel, and later on in Persia. And the second part of the book is those visions that Daniel has about the end of days. Now, Daniel receives a Babylonian name also, Belshazzar. Okay? It sounds almost the same as the name of the king we're gonna deal with. It's a slightly different spelling. There's both kind of sound Belshazzar. So I'm gonna stick with Daniel's Hebrew name, Daniel, because otherwise you're gonna get confused if I say Belshazzar, I mean the king, or Belshazzar, Daniel. Belshazzar in Babylonian means guard the life of the king, which is kind of ironic because Daniel is the one that's going to tell Belshazzar, the king, that he's going to die. Okay, so what's going on over here? What's the book is all about? So Daniel is one of the kids that of the upper class, the Jewish kids from families, upper class families in Yehuda, that were taken from Eretz Israel by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Bavel, in the times of Jehoiakim, who was the king of Yehuda. So as we know, the Galut, the exile of Yehuda, started about 18 years or so before, or 20 years or something, actually more, before the destruction of the first temple. Okay, so what happens is that those kids are being sent from Israel, from Yehuda actually, to Bavel, and Nebuchadnezzar kind of have them over there, give them the best schooling and the best education, Babylonian, of course, because he wants them to be his advisors. These are the upper class. He realized there's a lot of intelligence, there's good DNA in those kids, and therefore he wants them to be his advisors, and he's gonna invest in them since they're kids. So together with Daniel, you have Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, those four boys, and that's the one that we know about, but probably there were more. But Daniel was kind of the leader among those boys. And Daniel was made a name for himself in the Babylonian court as a person that has the ability, the knowledge, the capability of solving dreams. And because of that, he became very, very high rank, like all the way up there, very close to the king. Similar to a different story, right? Deja vu to the story of Yosef, right? Sounds familiar? Remember that? Okay. So Daniel and his friends decide to keep the laws of Judaism and the Torah, even though they're in a very difficult situation. And that becomes one of the foundations or one of the most important aspects in the personality and the development of Daniel. So Daniel solved a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had that nobody was able to solve. And because of that, Nebuchadnezzar appoints Daniel and his friends for very important positions. However, when the king obeys them to worship the idols, and actually specifically it was in the valley of Dura, where Nebuchadnezzar had a tremendous statue of himself, and he asked them to bow down and worship that idol. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are willing to sanctify God's name, and they refused, and because of that, they're thrown into the fiery furnace. Okay? Now, I'm going to share my screen for a second again. Of course, that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were saved, and that impressed the Babylonian king so much that he says the following. Belshazzar, chief magician, in whom I know the spirit of the holy gods to be, and whom no mystery befalls, tell me the meaning of my dream vision that I have seen. Right? That's before. That's Daniel. That's, as I told you, Belshazzar is the Babylonian name of Daniel. So Belshazzar talks to Belshazzar. It's kind of like tongue twister a little bit. To Daniel, and he said to him, I know that the Spirit of God is with you, and I need you to solve my dream. Nobody can do that except for you. Okay. By the way, in the story where Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, as you can see, are thrown into the fire pit, Daniel is not part of that story. Now, it seems that this is, by the way, this is another story about Daniel. Daniel has been thrown later on, we're going to talk about that in a couple of minutes, into the lions, huge cage with lions, and he's saved again. That's going to happen later in his life. I just decided to add all this art that I found into our slide show. Anyway, it seems that after Nebuchadnezzar dies, Daniel is not doesn't have the same status as before. Why? Because the next time we hear about Daniel, he's also called to solve a dream, but he's not even in the courtyard. He's not even in the palace anymore. Right? If you need to get somebody to the palace, whatever, to the Senate, and he is not there, that means he's not up high there. right? His office is not in the palace. And what happens is that, this is our story actually, he's able to solve that riddle that happens. And according to Daniel's explanation, what happens is that Belshazzar's kingship is going to end. God has decided that it's going to end, and it's going to be divided between Madai and Paras. And indeed, Belshazzar, on that very night that is talking to Daniel, is being killed by the Persians. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen here. This event was this very, very famous painting by Belshazzar, by Rembrandt, Belshazzar's Feast. And that's exactly our topic today. We're going to discuss that feast. We're going to talk about what happened in this, because guess what? The hidden woman is either Belshazzar's mother or grandmother, that she is the key for the solution of this riddle. You can see that riddle here, that as Rembrandt understood it, which is very significant. We're going to talk about it in a second. So, before jumping into this scene, I want to continue with the history of Daniel for a second, just to put things in perspective. So, what happens is, after Daniel solved the riddle, he becomes the third most powerful person in the kingdom of Babel. And later on, when the Babylonian Empire is defeated by the Persian one, he becomes very important person also in the Persian courtyard. Back to here. Right, this story, or actually of Daniel here, or actually better one is this one. Daniel in the lion's cage. When he is working for Darius the Persian, he's got a lot of enemies. A lot of people are jealous of him. And they kind of manipulate the king to throw anyone who prays to a different god other than Darius to the cage of lions. And they persuade the king to do that with Daniel, because Daniel continues to daven every day 3 times to God towards Yerushalayim. And what happens? Of course, the lions do not touch him. And everybody else that is thrown into the cage, of course, dies. And because of that, Daniel is being recognized by the king and receives a lot of honor. And what's important is that nonetheless, whatever happens, in spite of everything that he's doing, and his status and everything, Daniel does not forget where he comes from. You know, all the time we see that, like, you know, the text tells us that he's davening towards Yerushalayim. Even when he has this vision about the end of the exile, right, and Shivat Zion, and going back to Yerushalayim after the exile, after 70 years, he prays for the rebuild of Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim and the return of the Jewish people into Eretz Israel. And he says, actually, very famous pasuk that we use in our tachanun, our daily tefillot, Hashem Shema, Hashem Salacha, Hashem Akshiva ve'aseh al te'achar, למענך אלוהי כי שמך נקרא לך ועל עמך. Very famous pasuk from Daniel. We use almost every day in our daily tachanun. We say, he said, God, please listen, forgive us, listen to us. Don't wait, because your name is so great, and not only, and it's also on your city. Have mercy on your city and on your people. These are verses that talked about Geula, the redemption of Israel, and that were, as I mentioned, part of our Siddur. Okay, as I mentioned before, six of the chapters in Daniel are written in Aramaic, which was the spoken language among the Jews in Babel and in Persia. And actually, later on, when those Jews are coming back to Eretz Israel in the beginning of the Second Temple, that was the reason why this book, the book of Daniel, was more popular than other books in the Bible, because the people spoke Babylonian and not Hebrew. So they felt more comfortable learning the book of Daniel that was written in Babylonian. The common people did not speak Hebrew. They spoke Babylonian. And actually, the Mishnah tells us something fascinating, like hard to believe, that in the times of the Second Temple, the high priest, some of the high priests were so ignorant that they could not deal with the Hebrew text, and therefore they needed to have a translator to Aramaic. And the Torah used to be read to them in Aramaic. I'm sorry, in Babylonian. Crazy. The high priest. Okay. The rabbis talk about the extreme wisdom of Daniel and say, if you take all the wise people of the world on one hand, and Daniel is and Daniel is on the second hand, he is wiser. Daniel by himself is wiser, has more chokhmah than all the wise people in the world together. Okay. Now, in the book of Daniel, it doesn't say whether Daniel was a prophet, just like what it says about other prophets, or whether he was a seer, a chozeh. The Talmud says that what? That Daniel was not a prophet, unlike his contemporaries, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And therefore, we understand, according to the Talmud, why the book of Daniel is not part of the section in Tanakh that is the prophets. It's in Ktuvim, right? It's not in the prophet section. And why? Because according to this approach, he was not really a prophet. So that started a whole debate among the commentaries whether Daniel was really a prophet or not. Everybody see the slide?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yes.
fine. But yeah, by the way, this is also from a famous, famous church in France, this of Daniel, with the lions. Okay, so was Daniel a prophet? According to Rashi, kind of. What does it mean, kind of? It means that he was not sent as a prophet, and therefore the fact that he didn't have a mission as a prophet doesn't mean that he was not a prophet. He was a prophet, but he didn't have a mission of a prophet, and therefore you can't say he was a real prophet, even though he was. He had the capability, but not the mission. Okay? The Rambam gives us he says that there are different levels of prophecy, the different levels. It's like, I don't know, like in the army, you have generals and you have corporals or whatever. And so he was like kind of a second level prophet. He was not like the real deal. The Ramban, Nachmanides says very simply, he was not a prophet, and that's it. Just like the simple understanding of the Talmud. And the Ibn Ezra says, no, he was, and he said he was a prophet, and he goes into a lengthy explanation why the Talmud said whatever the Talmud said, and how should we interpret that. Okay, let's go back to let's go here. A little bit of family tree, a little bit of like to understand what's going on over there. Who was Belshazzar, the Babylonian king? So according to Rashi, he was the son of Nebuchadnezzar and the brother of Mordok. Okay, why this is important, the brother of Mordok? Because we have some sources saying that Mordok was also the king. So according to here, we'll have to play with that. We'll see. Belshazzar was he was a king after his brother, even though he was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. The Mitzudat David says he's the son of Mordok and a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, that basically is going to, this debate is going to play a role in our understanding about the Hamalka Ha'em or Hagvira, the mother queen, the queen that we talk about. That's our lady for today. Whether that was Belshazzar's mother or grandmother. Because we know she was Nebuchadnezzar's wife. So the question is, if Belshazzar is Nebuchadnezzar's son, i.e. the brother of Mordech, that means that what? Means that that queen was his mother. However, if the Mitzudat David is correct, and Belshazzar was the son of Mordech, that means what? That lady, the queen, is or was his grandmother. Okay? Fine. According to Josephus Flavius, he was the grandson of the queen mother. So Josephus agrees with the Mitzudat David. Herodotus, who was, obviously not a Jewish commentator, but very important historian, is kind of considered to be the father of historians, Greek historian, says that he was the son of Nitocris of Babylon, and she was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. So that means he agrees with also with the Mitzudat David and Josephus Flavius that he was Nebuchadnezzar was indeed the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And the Talmud and Masechet Megillah explain to us, like, what happens in terms of who was the king and that kind of stuff. And the Talmud says the following: Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 45 years, and then Mordech for 23 years, and then Belshazzar for 2 years. Okay. Question is whether Mordech was Belshazzar's father or older brother. Okay? That's a debate between Rashi and the Mitzudat David, basically. What else do we know about Belshazzar? We know also that he was the father of Vashti. Remember her? First queen in the book of Esther, first wife of Achashverosh. We're going to talk about him also later on. So there's like all these connections to other stories in the Tanakh. So here's the debate. If indeed we're talking about, I'm sorry, I'm not there yet. If indeed, you know what? Let's go into that. Nitocris the Babylonian of Babylon. So she is known also. These are all. I'm going to do it very quickly because this is not from Jewish sources. I just collected that information. She was born in Bavel, and of course she's known also as the Queen of Bavel. She is mentioned in several sources, just like, for example, the one that diverted the river, the Euphrates River, in order to defend her city. Herodotus describes her as one of the most powerful queens of Bavel, and claims that she was involved with tremendous enterprises of building and etc. One interesting thing about her that she wrote on her tomb she asked, and I guess it was done. She asked that the following is going to be written: if one of the future kings of Babel will have shortage of money, he should open my grave and take as much as he needs. But if he opens the grave for no reason, it'll be very bad for him. That's what's written on her grave, on her tombstone. And Darius, the king of Persia, decided to open, according to this, decided to open the grave, and he didn't find any money, didn't find any treasures there, found only the body. And the following words: if you were not only so greedy and committed such horrible crime of opening the grave, it's your lust. You should have. So I thought it was interesting. But that's, according to one opinion, that's the Gvira. That's the queen that we're talking about in our discussion today. And most people believe that she was the wife of Nebuchadnezzar, which is our hidden woman for today. And it all makes sense because she's depicted also as a very strong, or described as a very strong woman. On the other hand, according to the other opinion that we're talking about, this was Nebuchadnezzar's grandmother, then we're talking about a different lady, Ametitis of Medea. And she was born in the year 565 BCE in Iran. According to that according to this approach, she is the wife of Nebuchadnezzar, and her daughter is Nitocris of Babylon. Okay, so it really depends if we're dealing with the mother or the grandmother. Ametitis married Nebuchadnezzar to formalize alliance between Babylon and the Median dynasties. And tradition relates that Ametitis, she yearned for the mountains of Medea, and she kind of convinced her husband, or maybe he did that as a gift for her, to build what is known as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to please her and kind of give her a reminder of her homeland, and planted those gardens. Okay, that's the tradition. The historians kind of disagree with that. Okay, so just a little family tree. If we have, sorry about that, if we have Nebuchadnezzar, okay, he's the second in this dynasty, is Nebuchadnezzar. So he had Marduk, and he had sorry, this is Nebuchadnezzar. According to this, they are brothers, and Belshazzar, that's his son, or this Marduk. So this is the confusion because they had the same name, whether Marduk was Belshazzar's brother or father. Therefore, Our Lady is Belshazzar's grandmother or mother. Okay, now Nebunait, this guy, was the king of Babel from the year 556 BCE to 539 BCE, and it was the one before the last one, and he left the kingdom with Belshazzar and went to fight, and he came back after 15 years to help, and of course Koresh comes, and what happened? They lost, as I said. The Persians took over, and Belshazzar dies, but his father or brother, he is put in exile until the end of these days. Now, what happened to Belshazzar himself? So the book of Daniel doesn't tell us anything about what happened to him. how he died, but the Midrash jumps in and tells us what happened, which is an interesting story by itself. So, according to the Midrash, Koresh and Darius were working as bodyguards in the palace of Belshazzar. And Belshazzar, following the news that he received from Daniel, he was very, obviously, he was not at ease. And he was afraid that somebody in the palace is going to try to assassinate him. So what did he say? He commands everybody, all his bodyguards, that anyone who's going to try to enter the palace, even if it's going to be somebody who's going to say, I'm the king, they should kill him and not believe it. Now, Belshazzar felt really bad. That's what we call it, halushis, after receiving the bad news from Daniel. And he leaves the palace in the middle of the night without no one seeing him. And then when he comes back to the palace, his own bodyguards refused to let him in because they told him, even if somebody is going to come and say, I'm the king, don't let him. And they said, isn't that the king himself who told us to kill anyone who's going to try to enter with force into the palace, even if it's going to say that he is the king himself? And they decide and they kill him. So his own people kill him, and they become, of course, the leaders of the new empire, the Persian Empire. And now I come to the story of this very, very famous painting. The Feast of Belshazzar is described in the book of Daniel in the 5th chapter, and it's all written in Aramaic. What's going on over there? This is now the meat and potato of our class. So Belshazzar is doing the feast. And when he had like a couple of bottles of wine, he commands to bring the goblet, the Gevi'im, Kiddush cups, that were taken from Beit HaMikdash. Who took them from Beit HaMikdash? It's Nebuchadnezzar and the destruction of the first temple. And Belshazzar uses those cups that were stolen from the temple, uses them to drink together with his wives and his mistresses and like all the party that was going on over there. And the holy objects, those goblets, are being desecrated by Belshazzar as simple cups. Sounds familiar? Something else, right? Yeah, story of beginning of Megillat Esther. Right? Over there's also a king. He also, according to the tradition, uses the treasures that were taken from Beit HaMikdash. According to this genealogy, we understand that was his great-grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, right? And because of that, there's a lot of stuff that's happening later on. The whole story of the Megillah is about that. Okay, but back to our story. So they're having a good time and they're drinking from those goblets and blah, blah, blah and everything. And in them, all of a sudden, there's a spooky moment. And all of a sudden, what happens? Human fingers, like a hand of a human, appears. And that hand writes on the wall the following: Mene mene tekalu farsin. Yeah, you can see it. Mene mene tekalu farsin. This is how Rembrandt at least understood it, which is very significant. We're going to talk about it in a minute. When Belshazzar sees that writing on the wall, and by the way, this is the source for that phrase, the writing on the wall. This is where it comes coming from. He really, he becomes white. He really have halushis when he sees that writing on the wall. And of course, he summons all the magicians and all the, wise people and everything. And he tells them, anyone who is going to solve that riddle and tell me what exactly it means will receive a royal garment, will receive a lot of, like a special necklace, a gold necklace that only the ruler was allowed to wear. And that person who solved the riddle is going to be also the third in line, or the third most powerful person in the kingdom. And of course, no one has the answer. Here we meet our hidden woman today, the queen mother, or mother queen, whatever you call it, Hagvira. And she opens up her mouth and talks. That's the only thing that we know about her, that she talks, and this is what she says. Okay, so a little bit, I'm just going to read the English because we don't need the Aramaic here. Because of the state of the king and his nobles, the queen, that's Our Lady, she came to the banquet hall. Similar, remember the story of Ahasuerus, right? Because he asked to bring Vashti. She was not there. Same here, she's not there. Anyway, the queen spoke up and said, "O king, live forever. Let your thoughts not alarm you or your face darken. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of a holy ghost, of the holy gods in him. In your father's time, or grandfather, depends on the debate, illumination, understanding, and wisdom like that of the gods were to be found in him. And your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, sorceresses, I don't know what that is, Chaldeans, and diviners. Seeing that there is to be found in Daniel extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, to explain riddles and solve problems, let Daniel now be called to tell the meaning of that writing." This is a grand contribution, and this is all she says. And what happens? Daniel is called to the king, and he is asked to interpret the riddle. And he explained to the king, King Belshazzar, that this is the prophecy of destruction of the kingdom of Babel. He says the following: God, it's not here. God, Mena Elaha, he counted the days of the ruling of Babel. Tekal tekilta bemuznaya, meaning muznaim are those weights, right? God weighted the value of the kingdom of Babel. Ve'ishtekachat chasir, and found it deficient. Therefore, Babel is going to fall by the Farsen, Persians. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. Babel was divided between Paras and Madai, and Belshazzar, as I mentioned later on, is going to be killed the same night. Beblal yaktil Belshazzar Malka is going to die that night, and the Persians, of course, conquer Babel. Now, on this writing, the writing on the wall, it says, "Velo chahalak tava lemikra," meaning that the Babylonians, all the magicians, all the whatever, all the wise people were not able to understand what's written. All right, sounds like Pharaoh. Remember that story with Pharaoh? He had those dreams, nobody was able to interpret. It's always important to understand like a connection to other stories in the Bible when we talk about the story in the Bible, and like, what is it? What is this? What they're trying to tell us? Like, what's the connection? Anyway, so the Gemara takes it, and the Gemara says the following. Amarav, begimatria ichtiv leon. This is written in Gematria, not Gematria the way we understand it, but in a code. And it's written what? Yetat yetat idach chamat. Okay? What is it? It's a code that we call it Atbash. Atbash is Aleph Taf Bet Shin. A, Z, B, Y, and we replace the Aleph with the Taf, or the Taf with the Aleph. Same goes like, if I'm going to write something and I'm going to replace the A with the Z, or the Z with the A, I'm going to replace the Y with the B, etc. It's a code. And this is what it's written. It's written according to the interpretation of that, in that code, Yetat Yetat Idach Pugchamat. Okay. Next. So what did Daniel explain to them? And he said that the letters stand for the terms Mene Mene Tekel Ufarsin. Then explained the meaning Mene, God as Mana, right? Counted the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you are weighed, right? Tekila, on the scale and found lacking. And the Persians are going to divide your kingdom. And Shmuel said what? That the writing used to correct letters for those terms, but instead of being written in order, the 4 letters of Mem, Mem, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Ufarsin were written vertically. Okay? If I'm going to go here for a sec, you have to read it this way. Vertically, not from right to left, but rather vertically. And Rabbi Yonatan says, each word was written backwards. So that read right to left, and they spelled a different spelling. Rav Ashi says they were written with the first 2 letters of each word reversed. So if I'm going to summarize all those opinions, I have the following. According to Rabbi Yossi, which we didn't see here because it's already in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi says what? It was Assyrian writing, and that was not yet known. It was a writing from the future, and therefore they were not able to interpret that riddle. Rav said it was an AZ code, Atbash. And what he says, it's Yetet Yetet Adach Ukhamat. Shmuel said it's a different code. It's from vertical. Memtos Nan Kafe Al Ran. Rabbi Yochanan said you have to read it in a different way. That's the way you write it. And Rav Ashi says it's two letters, 2 letters. Okay. Now we have like all those opinions, either from up, vertically and not from right to left, from the end to the beginning, or flipping the first and the second letters, or flipping the last letter with the first letter, all those kind of stuff. Now, if I'm going to ask you whose interpretation of all those 4 or 5 opinions that we find in the Talmud, whose interpretation is the one that Rabbi Rembrandt, maybe this is going to be a bigger and more better here. Rabbi Rembrandt, as you can see, took the interpretation of Shmuel. So I guess Rembrandt knew Talmud. And it's actually, it makes sense because apparently he had a bunch of friends that were rabbis, but not only that, they were talking about the same guy who was Spinoza's teacher of Moshe something that somehow was connected to Rembrandt as well. And I don't know exactly how. So I guess he had some insight to the opinions in the Talmud. What's interesting is that it's not only that Rembrandt was the only one who was fascinated by that. He's not the only artist, but also the oratorio by Handel. Handel wrote an oratorio also by the name of Belshazzar, and this is for this. These are the words that are taken from the 44th chapter of Handel's oratorio, and you can see Handel wrote those words as well. Mene mene tekelu falsim. This is part of the poem that to describe that scene in the oratorio, and also there's another oratorio by the name of the Belshazzar's Feast by William Walton, another later composer. Okay. So now, let's take it another step. Generations after Daniel interpret that riddle to Belshazzar about the ending of Babel, Chazal in the Talmud tell us about another king in a different time, also had a conversation with a bunch of Jews, and the parallelism between the two stories is definitely not coincidental. The Talmud talks in Masechet Tamid on page 32b, talks about Alexander the Great, Alexander Mokdon, Alexander the Great, that conqueror of most of the world as it was known at that time. And he was known not only as a brilliant general, but also as someone who was seeking wisdom all the time. And Alexander, according to the story in this Talmud, met the elders of the Negev, the elders of the south, the group of people, Jewish people that we don't know anything about them, and they are not mentioned in any other source. And he asked them a bunch of questions. And it's going on and on and on and on for a while, a lot of questions. And, Alexander he conquered the land. So he was the ruler. And it was a very tense conversation between them. And they kind of like, as we say, gave him stochen. It's like they kind of gave him, they were nudging him, and they were like being like fresh with him, and they kind of like hinted to his demise, and then they hinted for his near ending, etc. At some point, he gets really angry, and he threatened to kill them. And then they tell him, well, if you're going to do that, it's going to be your loss. And just like Belshazzar, he gives them royal garments and the gold necklace, just in the story of Belshazzar, that he received that from, Daniel received that from Belshazzar. And they, just like Daniel, take the gifts, but they tell him, we have no interest in all this stuff, all this superficial stuff. So in both stories, we see the power of the weak against the strong, but who is really the weak and who is really the strong, right? The strong is supposed to be Belshazzar. The strong is supposed to be Alexander. But who is really the one that has the power? It's Daniel. Who's the one that really has the power? Is the Jewish elders. And perhaps the rabbis of the Talmud are hinting here something. And they have like a really, they're saying, look, remember the story of Belshazzar and Daniel? Belshazzar tells that Daniel tells Belshazzar that what's going to happen? He's going to die. That's going to be the end of it. Perhaps the rabbis of the Talmud are saying the end of Alexander is near also. Same story. So this is why it's so important to always remember what's the context. If the Bible and the Talmud, whatever our sources create a connection to a different story, we need to understand always why. Why? There's a reason behind it. And guess what? Alexander was murdered also in early age. And here is yet another example to who's the one that really is the strong one. It's actually the one, not the ruler, the one who was conquered, the one that allegedly had nothing. Right? This child, Daniel, the Jewish child against the king of Bavel. Same goes here. It's the elders of the Negev against Alexander. You think he is strong, they're weak. It's the opposite. Okay. Moving on. Okay. So the question is, why specifically in this feast, Belshazzar decides to take out the vessels, the goblets, the treasures of the temple? So you can say, well, he was drunk, then, But my understanding is that drinking wine was not his first time. So there's got to be a reason here. So here's what the Malbim says. The Malbim says the following, right here. Ufirshu Chazal, and Rabbi says, Belshazzar was familiar with the prophecy of Jeremiah. What was the prophecy of Jeremiah? That the kingdom of Bavel is going to last for 70 years. And they calculated the time. And they realized, well, Jeremiah said that we're going to last for 70 years only. Where we're more than 70 years, that means it means what? That Jeremiah was wrong. Not only that, Josephus tells us that at that time, second reason, that at that time what happened, that Belshazzar, the Babylonians were fighting, as we know already, the Persians. And at that point where the feast is taking place, who is winning the battle? Babylonians. It's going to turn later on. That night is going to turn. But at that point when they have that feast, the Babylonians are victorious. That means the stars are with us, powers with us. And that means our gods are superior. And therefore he had that big feast to give also thanks to his gods. And to show also that there's no reason to consider God, i.e. the Jewish God, because what he said by his prophet, i.e. Jeremiah, that the Babylonian kingdom is going to be extinguished after 70 years, he was wrong. So there's no reason to fear from that. Therefore, he commanded to bring the vessels from the temple, and therefore, because Jewish God is passé, and therefore there's no reason, and there's no holiness, and there's no reason to consider his vessels from the temple, his temple, as have any power to them. Now, in our chapter, the feast of Belshazzar, you could think that this is like, oh, they were just drunk and whatever, they were careless. But the Gemara, the Talmud says it as a what, as we see from the Malbim also, that it's kind of a victorious. It was a party of victory. What was the victory? It's the victory on the prophecy of Jeremiah and whatever, and the whole thing that it represents, that Jeremiah says that it's going to be the end of the Babylonian kingdom after 70 years. And here's the Gemara. The Gemara in Masechet Megillah in 12a says the following: i.e., what is the calculation of Belshazzar? How come he made that calculation? Jeremiah said that it's going to be your end, i.e., Babylonians. It's going to be your end after 70 years. It means that Yerushalayim is going to be built after 70 years. Here's the calculation. חשוב, 45 לנבוכדנצר, ו-20 מותלת דאביל מורדה. ותרתי דידי, ה-70. What did he say? He said, well, 45 years, Nebuchadnezzar, he was the king, 45, plus Evil Mordach, right? Mordach, 23, right? That's together 68. The Tarte Didei, and 2 of mine, Belshazzar says, Hashivim, made it to 70. Amar, Hashtabadai, tu lo mifreki, afik ma'ane debei mikdasha ve'eshtamesh behu. He says that means now, since 70 years have passed, definitely they're not going to be redeemed. I'm going to take out the treasure from the temple. I'm going to use them. Now, basic question, why did Belshazzar, you got to be like pretty stupid to think that this is going to happen, as we say, punkt on the day. It's 70 years. 70 years is kind of roughly. Like, why didn't he fear that this is going to happen maybe like in a month? Maybe it's like a little bit longer. Why? It's kind of a basic question. And the answer is probably because, again, the prophecy of Jeremiah. Because prophecy of Jeremiah is, it seems that it's indeed going to happen. In the battle between the Persians and the Babylonians, right? Because according to the prophecy of Jeremiah, Persia is supposed to be victorious, the Persians. What happens at the time of the feast, or just prior to the feast of Belshazzar? The Babylonians are victorious. So they're saying it's not only 70 years, it's also, we're supposed to lose in the battle, but we're winning. We are winning. So all this Jeremiah and his nonsense, forget it. It's not going to happen. So therefore, he says, if it's not relevant, I can do whatever I want. And I'm going to show that the Jewish God is wrong, no relevant. So it's not only the physical victories, but it's also the spiritual. It's to show I'm not afraid of the prophecy of Jeremiah. I'm not afraid of the Jewish God. Okay, going to go here. And according to the tradition, and we kind of like mentioned that, it's very, very similar to the feast of Achashverosh in the story of Megillat Esther. The story starts with what? With a party. Yamim Rabim, 80 u'me'at yom. The king has a party for 180 days. Why does he have that party? So what are the reasons for Achashverosh's party? Bunch of ideas. Rashi says, was able to sustain his reign. A lot of power shifting and a lot of stuff going on over there for a long time, and finally, after many years, Ahasuerus was able to sustain his reign and get rid of all the opposition. Ibn Ezra says no. He had fighting with enemies, not from the inside, from the outside. And since he was victorious at that time, he made that party. The Midrash says something different that also connected to our story. What happened? He found the treasures of the temple. Remember, who took the treasures of the temple? Nebuchadnezzar. Who was Nebuchadnezzar? Nebuchadnezzar was the great-grandfather of Vashti. That's his wife. So his great-grandfather-in-law was the one who took those treasures, and his grandfather-in-law was Belshazzar. That's probably, so he was in their position. And if you took over that kingdom and you marry the princess, there's a good chance you have access to those. And he found them. The Talmud says another thing, calculation of Jeremiah's prophecy. The Talmud says also here, Ahasuerus understands that what Jeremiah, the prophecy of Jeremiah about 70 years in Galut is not going to take place. We're already, now you can ask me, oh, but Belshazzar was calculating 70. How Ahasuerus, 2 generations later, still dealing with that 70 years. So option number 1, they were not very good at math. And just kidding. And option number 2, that they had different calculations and they had different calculation, like, what is the starting point from which you are calculating. So here you have it, the different opinions for the reasons for Ahasuerus' party, Rashi, Ibn Ezra, the Midrash, and the Talmud. And that's, of course, the connection, one of the connection to Ahasuerus. There's also, by the way, another resemblance is the story of, if you remember, Ahasuerus, when he drinks the wine and he said, Tziva lehavi et Vashti HaMalka, and he commands to bring Vashti, just like here, Belshazzar commands to bring the vessels. So there's a lot of similarities here. The end of it, like the story, who is strong, who is really not strong, the hidden hand, right? We say that like, God's name is not found in the Megillah. Why? Because God's hand, right? Because the writing was on the wall all the time, but it's the hidden hand of God. Same goes for the story of Belshazzar. Point is, a lot of similarities, and the question is, what exactly we're supposed to learn from that? What is exactly this, what is Chazal trying to teach us from the story of Alexander, from the story of the connection to Joseph, the connection to, of course, to Ahasuerus, what's going on, all that stuff. And I think the question, if I kind of refine the question even more, I can say that probably what? The question is, why empires are defeated? Why empires are defeated? What causing empires to go down? And the Bible gives us a very clear, simple answer. Arrogance. Arrogance. So historians and philosophers and whatever deals with that in last generation, dealing what's their patterns or whatever, something that explains the rise and the fall of empires. Hundreds of books were written about that. Really thick books were written about that. Edward Gibbon, right, British historian in the 18th century that wrote 6 volumes about the Roman Empire. Paul Kennedy, that also British historian from the 20th century that write about the rise and fall of the great empires. William Schreier wrote about the Third Reich, and Pierce Brandon that wrote about the rise and the fall of the British Empire. Um, Tons of stuff. People are fascinated by that, trying to find the logic behind it and the patterns and what causes stuff like that. And the Bible, our Bible, deals with that, of course, many, many years before all those historians, and tells us the story in the 5th chapter of Daniel, describes the fall of the Babylonian Empire while bringing this term and inventing, so to say, this term, the writing on the wall. Mene Mene Tekel Ufarsin is the writing on the wall of Belshazzar during his feast, letting him know through the interpretation of Daniel that his end is near and the end of the Babylonian Empire is near. And Daniel also explained to him why this is going to happen, based on previous dreams that he had solved to his father/grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. One word, arrogance. Chazal expand on that and they say, taking out the vessels of the temple, using them for his feast, it's an expression of moral decay, doing something that is morally wrong. There's no respect to the people that you have conquered, to those who are below you. There's no respect to other cultures. There's no sensitivity to the beliefs of the other. This is exactly same writing on the wall that told us or showed us the end of the colonialism in the modern era. All those really heavy hundreds of thousands of pages that were written are just interpretation, expansion and interpretation to what Daniel wrote on those, to that riddle, very short riddle, just 4 words that appeared on the wall, Mene Mene Tekel Ufarsin. The solution for that riddle on the wall, the King Belshazzar, he knew it. He knew it very well. It was inside his head. That message, the warnings were giving already 2 generations before, a generation before, to his father, to Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel himself gave those warnings to Nebuchadnezzar. He said, if you're gonna do it right, then you're gonna last for a long time. You're gonna be successful. You can do that, but you gotta do it right. You cannot take advantage of the poor. You cannot take advantage of the weak. You cannot be insensitive to the people over which you are ruling. You have to have respect to the other cultures, other beliefs. Yes, you're the ruler. You won the battle. It doesn't give you the right to dismiss them. It doesn't give you the right to be insensitive. It doesn't give you the right to crush them. You're going to do that, you're going to lose. That's the message from God. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. And that's exactly what Daniel is telling Belshazzar. Time's up. You blew it. And the writing was on the wall. Now, everyone in the world is going to learn that. Everybody's going to know that. And everybody is going to know who's the one who gives power to the rulers, who's the one who decides who's going to be the ruler, who's going to be king, and who's going to die. And all that stuff, all that lesson was possible because of one lady that remembered the lessons of yesterday. That's the queen. That's Our Lady. Whether that was Belshazzar's mother, Belshazzar's grandmother, it really doesn't matter. But she's the one who were able to connect the past with the present, bring it to the future. Writing was on the wall. He didn't get the message, Belshazzar. He didn't recognize that, even though it was right there for a long time. She's the one who realizes it was there all along. And Danielle is the one that just had to deliver it, to bring it to the front stage, that message from God. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you.